Karoline Leavitt confronts Ilhan Omar and the Democrats in a tense press conference. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were waiting, and anticipation filled the air. Everyone sensed that this wasn't going to be just another press briefing. This was a confrontation. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt and Ilhan Omar. As the doors swung open, Leavitt entered the room with an air of calm confidence, resembling a gladiator stepping into the arena. The murmurs ceased, reporters straightened in their seats, and every camera turned in her direction. She adjusted the microphone, scanning the room before delivering her opening line with a sharp, unwavering voice. "Let's get one thing straight. What you're about to hear today will expose the biggest lie in Washington." A heavy silence followed. Reporters exchanged glances, and viewers at home leaned in closer. Leavitt remained unfazed. She had complete control of the room. For weeks, Ilhan Omar and the Democrats have been pushing a reckless and dangerous narrative. They claim to fight for justice, but today, I will prove otherwise. A voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Karoline, are you saying Ilhan Omar has been lying?" The room froze. The question came from a senior CNN correspondent known for being unrelenting. Leavitt smirked, leaning forward with her gaze locked on the reporter. "Not just lying," she said, her tone sharp and deliberate. "Deceiving millions of Americans." A few reporters gasped. A pen slipped from someone's fingers. A low murmur spread across the room. This was turning into a bombshell moment. At the back of the room, Ilhan Omar remained stone-faced, her fingers gripping the table. She knew what was coming. She just didn't know how bad it would be. She shifted slightly in her seat, maintaining a composed expression, though her fingers tapped against the table. This wasn't just another press conference. This was an ambush. A reporter in the front row spoke up. "Karoline, if you're accusing Ilhan Omar and the Democrats of deception, where's your proof?" Leavitt didn't hesitate. "Oh, I thought you'd never ask." She reached down, picked up a folder, and held it up for the cameras. "Right here. Concrete evidence that exposes everything." Omar crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "More Republican fear-mongering and conspiracy theories. The American people deserve better." Leavitt turned to her, her expression sharp. "Oh, we agree on one thing, Ilhan. The American people do deserve better. Better than the misinformation you've been feeding them." The tension in the room was suffocating. Some reporters whispered among themselves, others scribbled down notes furiously, while some simply watched, their eyes darting between the two women. The CNN reporter pressed again. "Then let's hear it, Karoline. What's in that folder?" Leavitt flipped it open. "Let's start with your own words, Ilhan, shall we?" She pulled out a printed statement. "You recently said, and I quote, 'There is no real crisis here. It's all manufactured outrage.'" She turned to the audience. "Tell me, how is it manufactured when crime is rising, illegal border crossings have doubled, and American families are suffering due to reckless policies?" Omar leaned forward. "That's a gross misrepresentation of what I said." Leavitt raised a brow. "Really? Then let's talk about what you didn't say, because silence can be just as telling." Omar's jaw tightened. Leavitt flipped another page. "When violent protests erupted, when small businesses were burned to the ground, when innocent people were harmed, you refused to condemn it. Why?" Omar scoffed. "That is not true." Leavitt didn't miss a beat. "Then say it now. Right here, right now. Condemn the violence." The room went silent. All eyes were on Omar. The cameras zoomed in. She didn't respond. Leavitt smirked. "That's what I thought." Reporters whispered among themselves. Omar's silence spoke volumes. Leavitt placed the folder back on the podium. "I have more, a lot more. But let's give Ilhan a chance to explain herself first." She gestured toward Omar. "Go ahead. Defend your record." Omar took a deep breath, steadying herself. Gladly, she straightened her posture, refusing to let Leavitt control the narrative. "Let's be clear about what's happening here," Omar began, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't about facts. This is about Republicans using fear tactics to divide Americans. Leavitt chuckled, shaking her head. Classic. When backed into a corner, deflect and attack the messenger. Omar ignored her, turning to the reporters. This entire spectacle is designed to distract from real issues: poverty, racial injustice, healthcare. While Karoline stands here waving papers around, real Americans are struggling. Leavitt leaned on the podium, smirking. Struggling because of failed policies like yours. Omar turned to her, eyes locked. Tell me, Karoline, what have you personally done to help struggling families? Other than grandstanding here today. A murmur rippled through the room. The reporters were captivated. This was turning into a real fight. Leavitt's smirk didn't waver. Well, unlike you, I don't just talk, I act. Let's go over a few things, shall we? She lifted another page from her folder. Democrat-run cities are seeing record-high crime. Businesses are fleeing. Families can't afford groceries. And you call that progress? Omar crossed her arms. That's a gross oversimplification, and you know it. Crime is a complex issue. Leavitt cut in. Not that complex. Enforce the law. Hold criminals accountable. Stop prioritizing politics over public safety. Omar's eyes darkened. You want to talk about accountability? Then let's talk about the corruption in your party. Let's talk about election lies. Let's talk about tax breaks for the wealthy while working families suffer. Leavitt's expression didn't change. You're right, Ilhan, let's talk about accountability. That's exactly what we're doing right now. The room was electric. The cameras zoomed in. And while we're at it, Leavitt continued, let's discuss something else. Something you don't want to talk about. She tapped her folder. Your recent campaign donors. Omar's expression flickered for just a second. Leavitt saw it, and she knew she had just found her next move. Omar shifted slightly in her seat but kept her expression firm. You're reaching, Karoline, she said. What exactly are you implying? Leavitt held up a document. I don't imply, I state facts. She placed the paper on the podium. Let's talk about the donors bankrolling your campaign, specifically the foreign-linked entities that, let's just say, have a very interesting track record. The room tensed. Reporters leaned in. This was turning into something much bigger. Omar's lips pressed together. Every donation to my campaign is legal and publicly disclosed. Leavitt smirked. Publicly disclosed, sure. But what about ethically disclosed? Because I have here a report showing that some of your largest donors have direct ties to lobbying groups that... Omar interrupted. And what about your side, Karoline? Should we talk about dark money fueling Republican campaigns? Leavitt nodded. By all means. If there's corruption, expose it. But don't change the subject. We're talking about your donors right now. Omar exhaled sharply. This is a smear tactic. It's what Republicans do when they have nothing real to offer the American people. Leavitt shrugged. If it's a smear, then refute it right here, right now. Tell us, why are these groups pouring money into your campaign? Omar hesitated. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face. Leavitt saw it, and so did the cameras. The room stayed silent, waiting for Omar's response. The seconds ticked by. Leavitt leaned in. No answer? Interesting. Omar's jaw tightened. This conversation is a joke. Leavitt smiled. You're free to leave, Ilhan. But walking away won't change the facts. Omar clenched her fists. I'm not going anywhere. Leavitt gestured toward the reporters. Then let's continue, because I'm just getting started. Omar leaned forward, frustration evident. Enough of this nonsense, she snapped. This is nothing more than political theater. Leavitt tilted her head. Funny, because the facts say otherwise. And speaking of facts, let's discuss one more thing your office conveniently ignored. She pulled out another document. The cameras zoomed in. Your office recently pushed against legislation that would increase transparency in campaign funding. Why? Omar scoffed. Because it was a Republican stunt to target progressive voices. Leavitt flipped through the pages. That's interesting because, according to the bill, both Democratic and Republican candidates would be subject to the same disclosure requirements. So why block it? Omar clenched her jaw. Because it was designed to silence grassroots movements and minority-led organizations. Leavitt shook her head. So you're telling us that making political donations more transparent is somehow an attack on minority-led groups? A murmur spread through the room. Even some of the usually sympathetic reporters looked uncertain. Omar exhaled sharply. This is a distraction from real issues. The people watching this don't care about these so-called exposés. They care about healthcare, jobs, and making ends meet. Leavitt crossed her arms. And yet, instead of answering the question, you're pivoting again. Let me ask you something, Ilhan. If there's nothing wrong with your campaign finances, why not welcome transparency? Omar's expression hardened. Because I don't answer to bad faith actors. Leavitt smiled, sensing the shift. That's what politicians say when they don't have a real answer. The tension in the room was suffocating. For the first time, Omar looked genuinely rattled. Leavitt leaned in, voice steady. We're not done yet. Let's talk about the other thing you've been avoiding. Omar's grip on the table tightened. She knew what was coming next, and she wasn't ready for it. Her fingers drummed against the table. She had been in tough debates before, but this felt different. Leavitt wasn't letting up, and the cameras were catching every second of it. Leavitt turned a page in her folder. Now let's shift gears for a moment. You've been in office long enough to take a stance on critical national security issues. And yet, there are statements you've made on record that raise serious concerns. Omar's expression didn't change. Let me guess. Another cherry-picked quote taken out of context? Leavitt smiled. I'll let the people decide. She picked up a sheet of paper and read aloud. You once said, some people did something when referring to 9/11. Do you still stand by that statement? The entire room went dead silent. Even the most skeptical reporters knew this was a dangerous question. Omar let out a slow breath. That comment has been deliberately misrepresented by bad faith actors like yourself, Karoline. Leavitt nodded. Right? So let's clarify. What exactly did you mean? Omar's lips parted, but no words came out. Leavitt pressed further. Was it just something? Or was it an attack on American soil that killed nearly 3,000 innocent people? Omar sat still. I don't need to explain myself to someone twisting my words. Leavitt raised a brow. So you refuse to clarify? Omar crossed her arms. I refuse to play into a dishonest narrative. Leavitt leaned forward. You mean a narrative where we hold public officials accountable for what they say? Omar exhaled sharply. This entire conversation is designed to put me in a bad light. Leavitt smirked. You know what's interesting, Ilhan? Every time I bring up something controversial that you've said, your first instinct isn't to clarify, it's to blame the question. The room stayed silent. The cameras kept rolling. Leavitt let the moment hang. You can deflect all you want, but the people watching at home see exactly what's happening here. Omar shifted uncomfortably in her chair. For the first time, she looked like she wanted this press conference to end. But Leavitt wasn't finished. Let's move on to the next issue. Omar's grip on the table tightened. Her posture stiffened. She could feel the weight of every camera lens. Every pair of eyes locked onto her. But Leavitt wasn't done. She flipped to the next page in her folder. Let's talk about something that really matters to the American people. Your voting record. Omar inhaled sharply. What about it? Leavitt's smirk returned. You claim to fight for the working class, for the everyday American. Yet, your voting history tells a different story. She held up a printed document. You voted against tax relief for middle-class families. You voted against tougher penalties for violent criminals. You even voted against a bill that would protect small businesses from overregulation. Why? Omar scoffed. Because those bills were written by Republicans who had no intention of actually helping the people they claimed to represent. Leavitt raised an eyebrow. So let me get this straight, you didn't vote against them because they were bad for Americans. You voted against them because Republicans introduced them. Omar's jaw tightened. That's not what I said. Leavitt didn't blink. Then explain it. Why block tax relief? Why make it harder for small businesses to survive? Omar shook her head. Because those bills were filled with loopholes and giveaways to corporations. Leavitt nodded slowly, then turned toward the cameras. And yet, the very corporations you claim to oppose are among your top donors. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged glances. Omar opened her mouth to respond, but Leavitt was already flipping to another document. Let's talk about the people funding your campaign, the same big-money interests you supposedly fight against. Omar exhaled sharply. This is ridiculous. Leavitt smiled. What's ridiculous is the hypocrisy. The voters deserve to know who you really serve. Omar clenched her fists. You can twist things all you want, however you want, Karoline. But the truth is, I fight for the people. Leavitt leaned in. Then prove it. Right here, right now. Silence. Omar swallowed hard. The cameras zoomed in. She had no response, and the American people were watching. Omar exhaled slowly, her frustration barely concealed. This is exactly why people don't trust the media anymore, she said, shaking her head. It's all about creating a spectacle instead of addressing real issues. Leavitt didn't budge. This isn't about spectacle, Ilhan. It's about accountability. The voters deserve answers, and all you've done today is dodge the questions. A murmur ran through the reporters. Omar could feel the shift in the room. Even the press, normally on her side, was watching her differently now. A journalist from the back spoke up. Congresswoman Omar, do you deny that some of your largest donors include corporations you've publicly criticized? Omar tightened her grip on the microphone. I've never taken money that influenced my policies. My record speaks for itself. Leavitt smirked. Exactly. And your record shows that you vote against the very people you claim to defend. Omar let out a sharp breath. Let's talk about your side, then, Karoline. Let's talk about the billionaires and dark money funding your party. Leavitt crossed her arms. Go ahead. I'm not afraid of transparency. Omar's lips pressed together. Leavitt leaned in. You're scrambling, Ilhan. The difference between us? I came prepared. You came with talking points. The room was still. Omar knew she was losing control of the narrative. The cameras were capturing everything. Her hesitation, her frustration, the way she struggled to hold her ground. Leavitt glanced at the clock. I can do this all day, but I think we both know you're out of time. Omar's fingers curled into fists. This isn't over. Leavitt smirked. Oh, I know. We'll be having this conversation again very soon. Omar pushed back from the table. The press conference was coming to an end, but the damage had already been done. Leavitt had won this round, and Omar knew it. Omar stood up, straightening her blazer as if regaining composure could erase the last hour. Reporters continued throwing questions at her, but she ignored them, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked away from the podium. Leavitt watched, arms crossed, a small smirk playing at her lips. A reporter turned to her. Karoline, do you think today's press conference proves Ilhan Omar is unfit for office? Leavitt took a breath, as if carefully considering her response, then spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. I think today proves one thing. When faced with real accountability, the Democrats panic. They deflect, they attack the messenger, but they never, ever answer the actual question. Another reporter stepped forward. Do you believe Omar should step down? Leavitt tilted her head. That's not for me to decide. That's for the American people. But I will say this: leaders should stand firm in their convictions, not crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. A few reporters scribbled furiously. Others exchanged glances. Omar had left the room, but her silence spoke louder than any answer she could have given. Leavitt tapped her papers on the podium, gathering them into a neat stack. I think that's enough for today. Any more questions, and you know where to find me. She turned on her heel, walking out the same way she had come in, unshaken, undefeated. The cameras lingered on the empty podium, the energy in the room still charged. Omar's absence was the loudest statement of all. The press conference was over, but the battle had just begun. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Clips of Omar's silence, her hesitation, and Leavitt's relentless questioning flooded social media. #HatedIlhan Exposed and #Leavitt Destroys Omar were trending. News networks aired heated debates, analysts breaking down every exchange, every pause, every slip. At her office, Omar scrolled through the headlines. Ilhan Omar panics under pressure, walks away instead of answering. Karoline Leavitt exposes Omar's hypocrisy. The video you need to see. Did Omar just end her own career? Her staff paced the room, phones buzzing nonstop. Congresswoman, we need a response. Omar closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling. Then she looked up. We stay on message. We focus on Republican corruption. We call this a political hit job, and we move forward. A pause. Then, a staffer hesitated. But, people are asking why you didn't answer the questions. Omar's jaw clenched. Then we changed the conversation. Meanwhile, across town, Leavitt was watching the coverage from her own office. A staffer walked in, shaking their head. They're already spinning this. Leavitt smirked. Let them. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the desk. Because the truth is already out there. And no matter how hard they try to bury it. She glanced at the TV, where a split screen replayed the press conference. Her calm, Omar's struggle. People have already seen what they needed to see. And just like that, the damage was done. Omar could try to shift the narrative. The media could try to cover for her. But the American people, they had made up their minds. And in Washington, perception was everything.